we will be discussing cardiac psych, but not in a conventional way that we have learnt in the undergraduate days, but in a very different loop. We call this loop as a pressure volume loop now. So, let us discuss cardiac cycle as a pressure volume loop with left ventricle as an example. So, let me start a pressure volume loop here. So, I have y axis and I have x axis. I will take on x axis I take volume, on y axis I take pressure. The maximum pressure that can be attained is about 120 millimeters of mercury blood pressure, doctors, and we have 0 millimeters of mercury pressure. Let us start with ventricular diastole, end of ventricular diastole. So, as diastole is over, right, ventricle will have on an average of about 140 ml of blood, and the pressure in the ventricle, remember doctors, I am taking left ventricle as an example. Pressure inside the left ventricle will be about 10 millimeters of mercury at the state of N state of diastole. Okay guys, so let us take up 10 millimeters of mercury and the volume is 140 ml, and this state is N diastolic volume, right doctors. This 140 ml of N diastolic volume indicates the end of diastole and onset of ventricular systole, doctors. What happens is, with the beginning of systole, the first event that is going to take place is the very first event that indicates systole is going to start is closure of AV valves, closure of mitral and tricuspid valve, contributing to S1 first heart sound. Contributing to S1 first heart sound is the indication that diastole is over and systole is going to begin, right. The very first phase of systole is isovolumetric contraction, where pressure in the ventricle will be elevated from 10 millimeters of mercury all the way to 80 millimeters of, from 10 to 80 millimeters of mercury, doctors. The pressure is elevated from 10 to 80 millimeters of mercury. Now, why it is called isovolumetric contraction? Because there is not going to be any change in volume. Just pressure alone is getting elevated, but the volume remains the very same 140 ml. And the reason is AV valves have just closed and semilunar valves are already in a closed state. As the pressure reaches 80 millimeters of mercury in left ventricle, there will be enough pressure in the left ventricle to push open the semilunar valves. So, end of isovolumetric contraction is indicated by opening of semilunar valve. Opening of semilunar valve. In left ventricle, it is going to be aortic valve down. As the aortic valve open, blood from left ventricle gushes out into aorta with tremendous velocity, increasing the ventricular pressure from 80 to 120 millimeters of mercury. So, the pressure is elevated from 80 to 120 millimeters of mercury. This phase includes a rapid gush of blood entering from left ventricle into aorta. We call this phase as rapid ejection. Once good amount of force has been dissipated, right, by pumping the blood from ventricle into aorta, the velocity of blood flow cannot be maintained any further. There will be progressive decline in the velocity of blood that exits out of ventricle into aorta duct. So, the phase of rapid ejection gradually gets turned into the next phase called as slow ejection. So, rapid ejection is gradually turned into slow ejection, right doctors. Now, the second phase where the pressure literally falls is called as slow ejection. Rapid and slow ejection culminates into a state called as protodiastole, and this phase gets the pressure exactly back to 80 millimeters of mercury, the minimum pressure in the aorta. So, the phase is called as protodiastole, that takes the pressure back to 80 millimeters of mercury, what is conventionally seen as a minimum pressure in the aorta doctors. Okay. So, this phase is called as protodiastole. At this phase, since the pressure in the atrium, in the pressure in the ventricle and aorta is more or less same, right? Aortic pressure keeps getting increased and ventricular pressure is going to reduce, isn't it? Because much of ventricular ejection is over. There is no pressure head to drive blood flow into aorta, right? So, there is no more chance that left ventricular pressure keeps increasing, but still aortic pressure is at least maintained at 80 millimeters of mercury by any chance. Aortic pressure will be far greater than ventricular pressure, that will try to get the blood in the aorta to flow back into the ventricle. As aortic blood tries to flow back, it shuts the aortic valve closed. So, end of protodiastole indicates closure of semilunar valves contributing to second heart sound, that is S2, contributing to second heart sound, that is S2 doctors. So, once semilunar valves have been closed, already the mitral valves and tricuspid valves have been closed, recently semilunar valves are also getting closed. This phase is called as isovolumetric relaxation phase, ventricles are going for relax. Here ventricles simply goes for relaxation without any change in volume. And if you consider the volume of blood remaining in the ventricle after an ejection, the volume will be around 70 ml, which is called as end systolic volume, and the pressure will be about 0 millimeters of, right doctors. As the pressure reaches 0 millimeters of mercury, there will be opening of AV valves, right. As AV valves open in left ventricle, it is going to be mitral valve. As mitral valve opens, blood that has been accumulated in left atrium so far drops down into ventricle just because of gravity. Atrium is not going for contraction. Simply by the virtue of gravity, left atrial blood, 70% of left atrial blood falls into left ventricle, isn't it, right? So, just imagine 70% of ventricular filling happens without even a tiny speck of atrial contraction. So, that 70% is more than sufficient to live a very normal, very basic lifestyle without doing exercises, without undergoing any stress or strain. For a regular basic living, that 70% of blood from left atrium getting into the ventricle is more than sufficient. So, atrial contraction is not extremely life needy, okay. So, it is not mandatory that you can only survive with atrial contraction, okay doctors, which is why atria are called as primer pump, right. They do not actually get into pushing the blood for circulation, they simply assist circulation by increasing the ventricular filling, that is it doctors, okay. So, by reaching a pressure of 0 millimeters of mercury at the end of complete relaxation, there will be opening of AV valve. So, blood from atrium falls into ventricles. So, 70% of ventricular filling happens by this way itself. The last 30% happens due to atrial contraction that increases ventricular pressure also, right. So, if you categorize the percentages, okay, we can able to get the last 30% and the initial 70%, 70-30, right doctors. Out of initial 70%, there will be two phases of blood flow, right. This 70% is being split up, 70% is being split up into two zones. One is rapid filling of ventricle and the second one is slow filling of ventricles, rapid filling and slow filling of ventricle. The 30% is called as final rapid filling of ventricles doctors, okay. Now, the percentage of blood flow is 70% in passive flow of blood from atrium to ventricle and active flow of blood from atrium to ventricle is 30% of blood flow. Remember, passive 70%, active 30%. Slow filling is also called as diastasis. Slow filling is also called as diastasis, right doctors. So, this is how ventricular diastole takes place. Rapid filling, slow filling also called as diastasis, and final rapid filling due to atrial contraction, So, the 70% of blood flow happening during passive process, 70% of blood flow happening during passive process doctors will produce the heart sound, that is third heart sound S3. The last 30% of blood flow will produce fourth heart sound S4, that is due to atrial contraction. S3 happens in passive filling of ventricle, S4 happens in active rapid filling of ventricle. So we have the phases, isovolumetric contraction and isovolumetric relaxation. Isovolumetric relaxation, doctors. If you consider the phases of systole, we have isovolumetric contraction, rapid ejection, slow ejection and protodiastole or systolic phases. While coming to diastolic phases, isovolumetric relaxation, rapid filling of ventricle, slow filling of ventricle also called as diastasis, and final rapid filling of ventricle or phases of ventricular diastole. So this is how cardiac cycle takes place, doctor. Now let us look at the timings of cardiac cycle. Number 1, atrial events as well as ventricular events do have a constant timing, that is 0.8 seconds, while atrial contraction stays for 0.1 second and atrial relaxation stays for 0.7 second. Ventricles same way, the same 0.8 seconds of duration, where ventricular contraction takes 0.3 seconds, ventricular relaxation takes 0.5 seconds. The total duration of cardiac cycle is 0.8 second, doctors, both atrial events as well as ventricular events. 0.8 second is the total duration of cardiac cycle. That has been explained in a pressure volume loop. Now, to summarize this pressure volume loop, one point I want to emphasize here. The phase protodiastole. Remember, doctors, physiology textbooks, physiology entrance material emphasize protodiastole as a phase intervening between slow ejection and isovolumetric relaxation, whereas medicine textbooks, Harrison as well as cardiology textbooks, they call protodiastole, right? Remember, I will emphasize this, according to medicine and cardiology, you should not get confused, doctor, right? When it comes to a point where a question is being confused between physiology and medicine, right? Of course, there will be lot of discrepancies, right? Values differs between textbooks and textbooks. Physiology, within physiology book, Guyton says one thing, Genong says other thing. Physiology and pharmacology do have variations. Physiology and anesthesia, physiology and medicine, there will be lot of variations you could able to, cross through your entrance preparations. But whatever it is, when there is a point to make a final decision, always clinical textbooks takes up greater importance, guys, right? So the final references will be taken from clinical textbooks rather than basic sciences textbooks. So you need to know what has been given in Harrison's as well as medical and super specialty textbooks. So according to medicine and cardiology, protodiastole is the phase where slow passive filling happens. Slow and rapid passive filling happens, doc. Slow and rapid passive filling of ventricle, which means this 70% where S3 is here, 70% of ventricular filling, 70% of ventricular filling. Remember, protodiastole according to medicine, okay, protodiastole according to medicine is nothing but slow and rapid passive filling of ventricle. So the murmurs that happens at this phase particularly, okay, is called as S3 gallop or protodiastolic gallop. Okay, the murmur is called as protodiastolic gallop. Okay, protodiastolic gallop, which can also be called as S3 gallop. So remember, when the question paper talks to you about protodiastolic gallop, don't think of the duration between slow ejection and isovolumetric relaxation. That was wrong according to medical textbooks. Okay, you have to think of the rapid filling, initial rapid filling, and the next phase, slow filling, that is diastasis. The first 70% of passive ventricular filling is what is called as protodiastole, doctors. Okay, so this value, this phase, protodiastole, gets you the abnormal murmur, that is S3 gallop, synonymously called as protodiastolic gallop, right? So before we go to the next topic, I want you to understand these two principles. Number one is N diastolic volume. N diastolic volume is the amount of blood remaining in the ventricle once the entire diastole is over, right? So this volume of blood present in the ventricle before systole occurs is called as end diastolic volume, and that is exactly what is called as preload, doctors. Okay. End diastolic volume is nothing but preload. It is this preload that stretches the ventricle. More the end diastolic volume, more the preload. More the venous return, more the end diastolic volume. So, as more blood comes into the ventricles, there will be more end diastolic volume that contributes to more preload, more stretching of ventricles and more force of contraction. Frank Starling's law. Okay. So, remember, end diastolic volume is nothing but preload, doctors. Okay. We will come to afterload at the necessary time. As of now, just get to know this point. Remember, don't forget this, end diastolic volume is nothing but preload, and it is the one that determines the effectiveness or force of cardiac contraction. Determines force of contractility. Right, doctors? That completes our pressure volume loop and cardiac cycle. We will take up individual components and we will discuss the heart sounds, the pressures, the ECG changes relevant to cardiac cycles and all in the subsequent videos. So, as of now, this completes our pressure volume loop and cardiac cycle.